So I am a computer scientist, a tech person, but one who happens to be very deeply interested in democracy and how technology can potentially help us improve democracy if we develop and use it the right way. And so this takes me back to over 15 years ago when I was a PhD student at MIT. I had an idea of, how one way I think we could use technology to improve democracy. So I wrote this short paper and just put it online. I didn't really know what to do with it because I'd never written a paper on democracy. I didn't know how one would go about publishing such a thing. I wasn't a political scientist or anything. So I just kind of put it up there and let it sit. I didn't really figure out anything to do with it. But it turned out that I wasn't at all alone in thinking along these lines. This is an idea that many people kind of reinvented at there was actually an explosion of reinvention of this idea at almost the same time, and I'm not sure why that is, but quite a few people came up with ideas in this flavor with different terms. Liquid democracy is perhaps the most common now, but people also use delegative democracy, and there are different variations. But I think it's a really kind of interesting emergent trend that a lot of people are getting more and more interested in it, in this idea. Now, some of the core ideas actually go back quite a bit farther, even to Lewis Carroll's principles of parliamentary representation, long before the internet. But somehow it was kind of the internet era that made the interest really explode. So, what is liquid democracy? In short, it's basically an attempt to combine the best parts of representative democracy and direct democracy. That's kind of the simplest way to understand it. To understand it more deeply, we have to go back and look at representative democracy and direct democracy and see how they work and what their features are. So first, representative democracy. So we all know the basic idea. We have many voters or citizens who elect a small number of representatives to represent them in government. They typically form the leadership of a government, manage the typically much larger government bureaucracy and public sector below them, who answers back to the leaders, and the leaders ultimately answer back to the people by having to stand for the next election, right? And so there's this chain of accountability, of decision making and accountability. Now, this kind of works, which is great. It works, like they say, it works better than anything else we've tried, more or less, but it certainly has some problems too. And one of the problems I want to call attention to especially is what I like to call, as a computer scientist anyway, the information and accountability bottleneck. Namely, the fact that the only kind of structural thing connecting the voters with the government is this election process that typically comes once every few years and happens through the choice of a very small body of people, right? Now, in the voting process, when many voters are electing a very few representatives, we are, in computer science terms, compressing information. So let's say, a voter has a clear picture of the government he or she would like to have, or the voter preferences, and let's pretend for a moment that picture is a JPEG image. So excuse my loose analogies here. And kind of this is a good image, but if we have to compress it, say remove 99% of the information, compress it at a 100-to-1 ratio, well, it gets a lot fuzzier. Not too surprising. We've removed 99% of the information in it. If we have to compress it to a 10,000-to-1 ratio, well, you can hardly see anything anymore, right? And to go back to the original analogy, look at, for example, the information compression ratio defined by the US Congress, in which about 700,000 voters get to choose one representative, and basically all of the voter preference information from those 700,000 people have to be compressed into the choice of one representative. And how clear a picture can we possibly get from that choice? So again, this is a loose analogy, but I hope it's relevant. Now contrast this with the idea of direct democracy. It's a very, very attractive idea, and it's been around for a long time. The idea is to involve voters and citizens much more regularly and continually. For example, by having town hall meetings where people actually discuss issues at hand, immediate issues each voter is supposed to learn about, help decide on, and vote on particular issues, right? And this is a great idea in principle. And many people have observed that and have had the idea that, well, maybe using technology we can make direct democracy even more efficient. And there's probably a lot of ways to do it. We can make it more convenient. Maybe you can discuss issues and interact and vote on them on your mobile phone. This would be great. And actually, groups are doing just that in various contexts, and it does have some important convenience benefits. So that's a great idea, and it's certainly a beautiful dream. It has a number of significant problems, though, challenges. Some of the challenges are technological, but I want to defer those until later. And for now, I want to not focus on the technology, but focus on the basic nature of direct democracy, which is that they're made of people, right? And people have varying amounts of time, attention, and commitment, right? People who are asked to discuss and decide on issues, as Jim said, they need incentive to invest that time. And in many cases, we don't see that they just by default have that incentive, right? And so this is a widely varying and uncertain factor. Another is varying knowledge. Different people have widely varying knowledge or expertise on any given issue naturally. And it's been the experience of many people that in a room with such widely varying knowledge, often the loudest person, but not necessarily the most expert, but the loudest one often can easily dominate and kind of scare away, effectively disenfranchise the quieter experts that you really want to hear from, right? And so this is a well understood risk. And regardless, any person has only 24 hours in a day. And so even in small groups, many experiences are that direct democracy just takes a lot of time. And anyone who doesn't have that amount of time for whatever reason to invest kind of has to go away and let others decide for them. Even if the people who have don't have enough time might be the most expert in a particular issue, the people you might most want to get into this. So what can we do now? And so this basically illustrates a fundamental scale issue, the scaling problem. So now I'm stepping right into the trap that Lucy presciently left. As the computer science, she said, computer scientists are always talking about scale and efficiency. And I come up here and I'm talking about scale and efficiency. So direct democracy has a scale problem. And so this is a graph of about 100 countries with the population on the x-axis and the population in the public sector on the y-axis. And I'm going to very, very loosely, I know this is a horrible, I'm sure political scientists are horrified that I'm doing this, but using that as a very loose proxy for amount of governance-like work that seems to need to get done in a country. And the only observation I want to take you from this is kind of regardless of the country, whether it's a big government country or a small government country or whatnot, the line is pretty linear, at least on the log-log scale, meaning the more people any community has, the more governance work has to get done, the more issues have to get decided somehow or other, right? So if we wanted to use pure direct democracy to do this, something that works in a group of 20 participants that has 10 issues, well, that can work in that scale, but very not to scale. If you try to scale that up to 20 million, a country of 20 million citizens, well, that country is going to have on the order of 10 million issues to decide, one way or another, and you expect, each voter to decide, learn about and decide on 10 million issues. That's, never going to happen, right? So again, very loose analogy, but I hope it kind of gives a sense of the scale problem that we have to deal with. Now, of course, direct democracy in various forms can work. Not pure direct democracy, really, that I know of, but countries like Switzerland are almost legendary to have made some form of direct democracy work for quite a while. On the other hand, Switzerland is a pretty small country to start with. Most of the direct democratic voting happens in even smaller units of cantons or towns, and it's still very much a representative democracy. It has representatives who do most of the work most of the time, and voters only see certain select issues, right? So now I want to switch to the question, how could we rethink the structure of direct democracy to make it scale better and make it more participatory? And to get there, I want to make one simple observation of how to save time in a direct democracy system. Well, we can't expect everybody who's participating to necessarily catch up on all the issues, unless maybe they've been brought to a deliberative poll and given time and incentive to spend the time reading up on that. That's a great exception, but in the normal at-large society, normally most people aren't going to be experts on anything, on any particular thing. Instead, we have to take shortcuts, and often we take shortcuts. Humans take shortcuts by asking friends or reading the opinions of experts they trust or things like that. And if the friend or expert, their opinion makes sense to you, maybe you'll vote the way they suggest, right? It's a perfectly natural thing usually. Now, so finally, what is liquid democracy? Well, liquid democracy is, in essence, just technology-enabled, automated advice taking. When you want to take advice, you take it, right? For example, let's say we have a very active direct democracy, and healthcare is a hot topic. There's a lot of healthcare issues to vote on, but I'm not an expert on healthcare. I don't have time to keep up with this. So, but I know someone I trust who does know a lot more about healthcare than I do. And so a system supporting liquid democracy basically allows me to register my trust in that person and say, hey, for a while, I'm just going to vote like he is on, or she is on, healthcare issues or on some scope of topics, right? But only as long as I want. It's my choice. I can cancel that at any time and go back to voting for myself. So I'm in control, right? Now, this approach has several very attractive features. So first of all, I can choose different experts. I can delegate to different people on different subjects, right? So I don't have to choose just one representative to represent me all the time. I can potentially delegate to one person in one area and another person in a different area, right? And so this kind of gets around the tendency of representative democracy to presume we can find a generalist representative that's kind of good enough at everything. But in fact, because representatives, no one can be good and knowledgeable in everything, because representatives, kind of have to be generalists, but they're also in an incredibly competitive area. Well, they kind of have to specialize in politics and therefore can't specialize in any of the particular areas that they're making policy about, right? So this is an important problem. And liquid democracy tries to be a way to bring specialization into the structure of democracy, bring the benefits of specialization in. So another issue is basically the choice you have. So when you're choosing a representative in a typical standard voting, you typically only have a few options to vote for, who have to surmount fairly high hurdles to become a candidate. Now, there are good reasons for that, but which I don't have time, and I don't have time to get into. But the basic idea of liquid democracy is to free that up. Say, you know, if you have good advice and I want to take your advice, why shouldn't I be allowed to? I should be able to pick anyone to be my representative on a particular topic, right? And finally, this, you know, going back to the original, a variant of the original figure of you know, voters and how voters interact with government, this basically, in principle, creates a system where voters can delegate in different topics to different groups of either experts or people with strong interest in different topics. And they can interact with government, counterparts in government at lower levels in a much richer, broader fashion, rather than trying to squeeze all information and voter preference information and accountability through that little bottleneck at the top, right? So eliminating the information and accountability bottleneck, okay? So that's kind of the theory, right? How well does it work? We don't know yet. So, but fortunately, a number of enterprising groups have been trying it out. Most notably, the German Pirate Party, who for several years ran a very impressive experiment where they designed a tool called liquid feedback that would allow their party members to do discussions in this fashion with the delegation feature. And I won't get into all of that. But they learned a tremendous amount of, we got a tremendous amount of information and knowledge from this fantastic experiment, both in terms of what kind of works, what doesn't, what challenges there are, as well as data sets, you know, interesting data about how people behave in this kind of system. So we need more of this kind of thing. And fortunately, there are other groups doing this. Another one that got some attention much more recently was Democracia OS from a group out of Buenos Aires. And there are other groups that, as we speak, are trying to put more experiments like this into effect. So I'm probably close to out of time, but I don't want to try to paint a completely rosy, naively idealist picture about this, because, well, I kind of have said, well, let's fix democracy this way, right? Well, what could go wrong? Well, a lot can go wrong in any system if we don't get the details right. And we already know some possible ways not to get the details right, and there's a lot of others that I don't have time to talk about, and a lot of others that I'm sure we don't know yet, right? But I'll briefly review a few potential pitfalls and problems that we have to steer our way around if we want to deploy something like this. One is that came straight out of the liquid feedback experiment is the possibility of accidental concentration of delegated votes. So if most people in a community think that, well, this person is totally the top expert in this space, most people might tend to delegate their votes to that person. And if that's the only person, that's the top choice, they've suddenly created an accidental dictator, right, who basically wields most of the votes and completely dominates everyone else. And this is probably not what anybody intended, certainly not healthy. And so, we need to build in mitigations. One of the mitigations that's possible in this space is to ensure the system has a way even to encourage voters to delegate to not just one, but to split your voting power among multiple delegates so that it spreads out more. So, maybe the top expert does get most, the largest amount of voting power, but all these some slightly lesser experts get quite a bit too, right? So we have to think about how the system is structured to make sure that things like this go right instead of wrong. Another really key issue is voting privacy versus accountability. So in voting systems, we generally expect votes to be private, so to make sure that voters can express their opinion preferences freely. And ideally, we want to enforce that privacy so nobody can be coerced or their votes to be bought. But if the system is allowing you to delegate your vote to someone, well, don't you need to know how they're voting on your behalf, how you're using your vote? So this creates a clear tension. And so the Liquid Feedback project made all of the votes public, right? So because of this, but of course that creates coercion and vote buying questions, right? So that's an important unsolved problem. I think there's a lot of potential ways we could solve this. One of the ways using privacy-preserving technology is it's possible to allow voters to see approximately how their voting record compares with, say, a delegate's or a potential delegate's. Does this person agree approximately 75% or approximately 15% with you, without revealing any information about a particular vote? So you can't tell how they voted on any particular issue, but you can tell if they generally agree with you or not over time, right? But again, it's a matter we have to explore further. Finally, the way these are implemented is a really key issue. And all of the implementations I know out there are, to go back to Bryan's phrase, not decentralized enough, not remotely. They're full of single points of compromise, basically mostly just a single server. You just have to trust whoever runs that server. If they're compromised or hacked or anything can happen. So, so these are perfectly good things to, systems to run small-scale experiments in friendly environments. Don't, run a government on them just yet, right? So that, that'll take quite a bit more work, right? So we and my lab and many others around the world are working on building tools. So especially the blockchain community is very active and instrumental in trying to improve the tools we have to solve these kinds of problems. I won't get into that because that's a separate talk. But so I'm optimistic we will soon have the tools to solve this aspect better, but we're not there yet, again. So in conclusion, liquid democracy potentially allows voters to have individual choice of several things where they don't have choice now, whether to participate a lot or just a little in all the decision processes, choice of which topics to vote on directly versus let somebody else vote for you, and most of all, whose voting advice, who do you trust to represent you? And I still believe, 15 years after writing that bad initial paper, I still believe that some combination of these ideas can allow direct democracy to scale. But of course, there are many challenges to make this really happen. So how can we make it happen? It's going to take an effort of a lot of different types of people. Communities willing to run more experiments like this. Try it, in different flavors, see what works, see what doesn't. Again, in small-scale, non-critical experiments, researchers, especially academic researchers like Hélène, who can develop the theory and study the results of these experiments, technologists to build the tools necessary to run these things safely, and finally, and governments to enable the deployment, and just as importantly, set standards to make sure they are secure enough, private enough, and so on once they are deployed. So, thank you.
Should I wait for them to return? No? How do I make the PowerPoint work? Perfect. Miracle. Hi, everyone. So I'd like to first take this opportunity to thank Alejandra Larraín and Thomas Gonzalez from the Tribu Foundation, without whom I wouldn't be here today. And I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. It's my first trip to Chile, and it's been an absolute treat. So I also want to thank the other panelists for wonderful presentations. It was very inspiring. I see my role here in concluding this panel in providing a framework or a sort of big picture perspective maybe on this question of what does democracy mean, what should it mean, what could it mean in 2050, right? We are used to thinking of democracy as elections, periodic elections, and party competition. We're used to thinking of it as voting every few years. We're used to thinking of it as consenting to power exercised by others. But if we zoom out from this historic period, and in fact from the last 200 years, and we go back, as Jim did earlier, to ancient Greece, and specifically 5th and 4th century Athens, we find a completely different version of democracy that involved neither elections nor party competition, nor most of the institutions we're familiar with. It meant, democracy back then meant ruling and being ruled in turn, as Aristotle put it. It meant walking into the space of power, the people's assembly, and deliberating with your peers and making decisions with your peers on the spot. It also meant having the right to participate in a lottery, to be selected, to be on this council of 500 that allowed you to set the agenda for this assembly of the people. So in those days, power was open, accessible to citizens. And granted, citizenship was a very exclusionary notion, excluding women, among others, slaves, foreigners. But once you counted as a citizen, you were in. Power was accessible to you. But we're told today, democracy on the ancient model is not accessible to us. It's archaic, it's dated. We live in mass commercial societies, and there are just too many of us. And we're just too busy making money, raising our children. We just don't have time for politics anymore on that scale. So we have to live in representative democracies where we delegate our power to others. So somehow the move to representation has meant a move to closure and exclusion. It's meant delegating power to people who we cannot become a part of. And I don't know that this move had to happen. I don't know that representation had to mean exclusion and closure of power away from ordinary citizens. You see that move, for example, in a famous article of the Federalist Papers. Jim quoted Madison earlier, but he also said something, which is that the difference between modern governments and ancient governments lies in the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from modern governments. So it's basically stated right there and then that the people have nothing to do with modern democracy, right, in their collective capacity at least. It's combined with the view of representation as a filter, as the way by which elected elites can refine and enlarge our views, but not necessarily take them on board directly. So did it have to be that way again? Think of it this way. What is the likelihood that in the 18th century we got the institutional design right the first time around? What's the likelihood that we wove our institutional tapestry from the right pattern? And I think it's unlikely. I think we can do better, and I think we could take the roads not taken in the 18th century, and there are many. There are many directions that democracy could have taken then that could take again today with the new technologies we have and the knowledge we have accumulated about what works and what doesn't today. So that's what I want to try to expose you to. But first, let me take you to a little journey to Iceland, a tiny nation in northern Atlantic. There are about 320,000 citizens in Iceland. It's a tiny nation. And they do things very interestingly there. So for one thing, when they want to overthrow a government, what they do is they bang kitchenware, literally pots and pans, in front of parliament. They throw some yogurt and some fruit at the wall for good measure. And the politicians are like, okay, we resign. That's how revolutions happen in Iceland. So in 2008, that's what they did. It was called the Pots and Pans Revolution. They got a new government. It happened because in 2008, you may have followed the news back then, the financial crisis hit Iceland particularly hard and burned 7 times their GDP. It was a massive disaster. So they got a new government, and this new government said, we're going to give you a new constitution, because this is something that the protesters had asked for, and that's something that had been promised to the Icelanders since 1944 when they got their independence. So they also did something very innovative when it came to the writing of this new constitution. First, they randomly selected a group of 950 citizens to set the agenda for the Constitutional Assembly. They gathered them for a day and asked them to think about the values and principles they wanted to see entrenched in their new social contract. And among the ideas that came up were the idea of national collective ownership of natural resources, in response, in fact, to the enrichment of a handful of fishermen that were very well connected to the business and governmental class, who had basically exploited the natural resources of Iceland for free and had made a killing in the 80s. It was a big issue. It's a question of oligarchy in Iceland as well. Another problem that this National Forum talked about was the status of the national, the evangelical Lutheran Church, the National Church of Iceland. Should they keep it with a national status like that, or should it be considered discriminatory, and should it be sort of made more, religiously neutral? So these are some of the questions that came up. Now, who do you think they chose to actually write the Constitution? They first said no politicians. So they excluded by law all the politicians in power. They were really fed up. Second, sorry, I wanted to show you that later. Second, they said, who wants to do it? 523 people volunteered. They ran a campaign, which was covered by the media not too well, because how do you cover 523 candidates? Maybe technology could help, actually. And eventually, 25 were elected, among which 10 women, 1 student, 1 farmer, 1 union representative, 1 pastor, 1 art director, 1 filmmaker, a couple of academics as well, 2 mathematicians, a political scientist, an economist. So really a diverse group, and you can see it on the picture on the website. On the front row, you see Freyja Haraldsdóttir, who is a famous human rights activist in Iceland, and also a severely disabled citizen. She was very instrumental to the human rights section of the new constitution. So a very interesting process so far. It gets even more interesting because these 25 said, we don't want to write this new constitution behind closed doors. We want to engage with the public. We want to connect with the larger citizenry. So we're going to put our drafts online and gather feedback from the public. So that's what they did. Writing a constitution on the internet, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it went actually really well, and they got extremely good ideas. They got ideas about the structure of the draft. In the existing constitution, what comes first is the president's rights, and then the court's rights, and then, at the bottom you have people's rights, and the list is very short. So the people on the internet say, we want to reverse the order. We want people's rights first, and we want more of them. So that's what, they took inspiration from that. They also got the idea for a right to the internet. That was proposed on a Facebook post by somebody who saw what was happening in Egypt at the time when Mubarak turned off the internet in response to the Arab Spring. They also got ideas about better formulations for transgender people's rights, for children's rights, for all sorts of things. In the end, 10% of the contributions made a causal difference to the text itself. So it wasn't just for show, because oftentimes these crowdsourcing can be just a marketing, experiment. And that's, of course, this whole process is very different from what we're used to thinking of when we think of constitutional processes, right? The Philadelphia Convention in the US, where 55 bewigged white men behind closed doors rewrote the social contract of an entire nation, or, but more recently, constitutional treatises for Europe. Not very participatory in spirit and practice. So why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this story because it got me thinking, and a lot of other people thinking, that we could do democracy differently in different ways, and that if the Icelanders could do it for constitutional law, which is often seen as the most technical law, the most difficult to do well, and the one that needs to be insulated from popular pressure, then why couldn't other countries do it, and why couldn't they do it for other things as well, like ordinary lawmaking or regular policy making? And so what I would like in the next step to do is propose a paradigm of democracy that I call open democracy, which tries to abstract away from this particular example, from the Greek example as well, and from a general contrast with what we are familiar with, a set of abstract institutional principles that should guide, that could guide institutional design. So I call these principles institutional principles because they are less abstract than, say, notions like equality, justice, freedom, but they are less empirically concrete than, say, bicameralism or specific set of electoral rules. So I call this paradigm open democracy. I call it open actually after familiar terms like open source software, open government, the open society of Popper as well, and the very idea of open-mindedness. I think it's also an important civic virtue that we need to cultivate. I'm going to present you 6 principles. In fact, there are more. There can be more if we think of democracy beyond the nation state, among other things, but in this presentation I'm going to focus on the framework we're familiar with, which is democracy at the level of the nation state. So the first principle that I see as essential and the sort of foundation for all the rest is what I call empowerment rights. Empowerment rights are rights that are meant to cut open a path from the periphery to the center of power so that almost at any point citizens, ordinary citizens, can access the decision-making process if they want to. They're distinct from what we're used to thinking of as liberal rights, because liberal rights historically invented as checks against power, as protections from abuse of power, as protection against domination. They were not meant so much to empower in the sense of helping people to gain access to power, but as giving them some freedom away from power. So freedom of association, freedom of the press, freedom of thought, etc. So I include those liberal rights, certainly, but I want to add to them things like a right to participate in any kind of mini-public, including deliberative poll, including citizens' assemblies, including the sort of randomly selected that the Icelanders experimented with the National Forum. I also include rights like citizens' initiatives, the possibility for people, when they gather enough signatures, to put a proposal, a law, or a proposal for a law to Parliament, so that Parliament is forced at least to debate it, and if the signatures are enough, forced to even either vote on it after proper deliberation or offer at least a counter-proposal to it. I also include things like citizens' right of referral. A citizen's right of referral is the right for ordinary citizens to, if they gather enough signature again, ask for a referendum on a law that turns out to be unpopular or dysfunctional. It allows the system to self-correct, if you will. And I finally include in these rights that empower vulnerable minorities, give them extra access to power in a way, to correct for historical injustices or the status of disenfranchised indigenous communities or something like that. So the second principle is democratic deliberation. I borrow it from a theory in political philosophy called deliberative democracy, according to which laws and policies are only legitimate if they've been debated on by ordinary citizens or by the representatives on equal and free terms. So it's the ideal of the deliberative democracy that you will often associate with people like Jürgen Habermas. And you would think that we already have some form of deliberation, right? But if you look, in fact, at what's going on in Parliament, you don't have any deliberation going on in Parliament anymore. The little deliberation that goes on takes place in committees behind closed doors. In the public sphere, do we have deliberation? No. We have two sides, sometimes more, shouting at each other or locking themselves up in their filter bubbles or their echo chambers. And our party system, I think, does that as a feature, not a bug. It's not meant to encourage deliberation, it's not meant to encourage open-mindedness. It's, if anything, it fosters the opposite. So I think we should design our institutions so that they maximize deliberation as opposed to hinder it the way it's currently doing. The fourth principle is what I call complex representation. So here, this is where the model departs more subtly from what we know as representative democracy. Because in a way, I, like Bryan and everyone here, really acknowledge that democracy is not completely feasible, that we need mediations and forms of representation. What I want to question is this idea that representation means elections. In fact, I could totally envision a democracy that doesn't have any kind of elections at all. So what do I mean by that then? Well, the type of representation I have in mind is what I call autocratic representation performed by citizens that are randomly selected. The kind of representation that citizens perform when they are part of a mini-public, like a deliberative poll, like a citizens' assembly, the sort of assembly that were experimented with in British Columbia, where they thought about electoral reform, for example, like the National Forum in Iceland, like citizen juries, like all these mini-publics that already exist and are tried around the world. I think this mode of representation has certain advantages that electoral representation doesn't have. Among other things, it taps the cognitive diversity of the larger group. It represents statistically, if you want, the diversity and the demographics of the entire population, as opposed to select a sliver of people that's very unrepresentative. And that ties to this point I made earlier about Madison favoring a filter model of representation. Well, one of the roads that were not explored in the 18th century were the idea of representation as a mirror. In fact, the anti-federalists who are pushing against a lot of the federalist proposals said, well, we would prefer an assembly that looks like the people, feels like the people, thinks like the people. The problem is that in the 18th century, they didn't know how to get that. They knew the Greeks used lotteries, but they thought that in a mass, at the large scale, this was not feasible. And they lacked the statistical knowledge and the technology of random sampling to actually implement that notion of a mirror image. So instead, they say, well, maybe we could have a smaller constituency. That way, when we elect people, we will select from the middle class, not just the gentry, right? We won't just have the natural aristocracy, but something slightly more representative. But of course, conceptually, it's less coherent than the federalist model, which explicitly said, we want the best and the brightest, we want the virtuous and the wise, and surprise, surprise, it will overlap with the richest and the most established. So I'm saying all this because I think we should really break with this idea that representation means election. It can mean other things. It can also mean what I now call crowdsourced representation, the kind of representation that happens when ordinary citizens show up on an online platform, and usually it's a few percentage, a few percent of the population at most. So this is not direct democracy. These are people taking on the role of citizen representatives, speaking on behalf of their peers, bringing to the table views and ideas because they feel like they're not adequately represented. So this is another form of representation that we could consider. It has also advantages, but also problems, in part because the self-selection that goes on really skews the demographics, right? You only get people that are extremely motivated, extremely educated, who have time, etc. But they can still perform a very useful role in this open democracy if we don't give them perhaps final say. They are like the bees bringing all the information and to the system. Finally, if we don't give up on elections entirely, we could revisit the model of electoral representation along the lines of what Bryan was talking about, delegative or liquid democracy. Again, there's so much more to be said and done about, to understand the pros and cons of this type of representation versus the other two, for example. There may be additional forms of representation that I'm not thinking of. And the important point is that we need to expand our mental space and consider these possibilities. So I explained to you 4 of those principles. There are 2 more. Those are more instrumental. I see them as accountability mechanisms, rotation and transparency. Rotation is very important to me because I think that we know now, we have thousands of years of experience, and we know that power corrupts. So how come we let politicians be in power for a lifetime? How come the turnover rate of the American Congress is 10%? How come, you're more likely to become a politician if your parents are politicians or already involved in politics? This is not democratic. So rotation is a principle of anti-corruption and democratic empowerment. Transparency, finally, is the embodiment of the, common sense view that light is the best disinfectant. So we need to, like the Icelanders did, bring to the public a sense of what's being said and done on their behalf in those mini-publics, in elected assemblies, in all these representative bodies. So as in the case of rotation, transparency will have costs, right? In the case of rotation, we might lose in competency, in professionalism. That's a trade-off we have to be willing to face and fix in other ways. In the case of transparency, maybe it will create the wrong kinds of incentives. People will sort of withdraw or perhaps not say what they really mean, etc. But I think, again, we'll have to figure out how the system fails to fix it. But I think as a default principle, it is more democratic than the opacity we're currently living with. So you might ask, okay, these are very abstract principles after all, so what does it look like to live in an open democracy, right? So in many ways, it might not be completely different from what we are familiar with, on the surface at least, but it could be. And my thought is that the central leitmotif of this new democracy would not be an elected assembly. It would be what I call an open mini-public. That is a public that is randomly selected, a few hundred people maybe. This assembly could be tasked with either agenda setting or legislative tasks, if it turns out that they are capable of doing that successfully. And it would be connected to other mini-publics. And all these mini-publics connected to each other would be connected to crowdsourcing and deliberating platforms where ordinary citizens could show up and contribute or just check on what's going on. And at regular intervals, you would also connect all of this to referenda, because eventually you also want to have some moments of direct democracy for very salient issues or very important ones. So that's what it would look like in my mind. And I think technologies could do a lot to make that possible. So I offer you this not as an institutional blueprint that's very detailed, but I offer it to you as a lens to just shatter some of your, perhaps, prejudices, as a lens to see the democratic deficits in the institution we're living with, and as a lens to envision what democracy could look like in 2050. Thank you.
Bueno, tanto me dieron muchas preguntas a la cabeza, pero... Ok, instrucción secreta, no transparente. Tanto en el planteamiento de Bryan como en el de Hélène me surge una pregunta inmediata. En el caso del planteamiento de Bryan, lo que yo entendí es que los ciudadanos deberíamos elegir entre nosotros mismos por área temática a quienes mejor saben o quienes mejor manejan un determinado tema para, en ese determinado tema, generar una asamblea que tome decisiones. Y en el caso de Hélène es más directo, propone una democracia directa que es la jubilación de los políticos. La pregunta es para los dos: ¿cómo jubilamos a los políticos? ¿Cómo jubilamos a los políticos que pierden elecciones y después terminan en otros cargos? ¿Ah? No quiero mencionar a nadie en el caso chileno, pero luego lo hemos visto, no me imagino a la gente en Santiago saliendo con una paila de huevo ahí pegándole para exigir que se vaya el gobierno por un escándalo. Por favor.
Yes. So great question. So the first part on liquid democracy and kind of how and the issue of subjects that you brought up, I presented that as an example of one way that delegation or shifting of voting power could be distributed, kind of more widely. But I don't want to get too hung up on that particular way. And there's other subjects might not work very well in some cases, and in some cases, we might have to come up with different mechanisms that would probably work better. I think that's, kind of figuring that out would have to be a critical part of the goal of, experimentation, see what works and what doesn't. And like I said, this is still a very early, immature, kind of paradigm for democracy. It has to be developed. And I can't really predict, exactly how it will work, what are the key ingredients. I think, and in fact, I think incorporating other elements, besides the ones I talked about, such as random selection, for some purposes, can also be a very powerful element. For example, especially when, say, a liquid democracy is young and it doesn't have widespread support, and it's facing a lot of entrenched power. You want to implement it in a permissionless way without, waiting for the powers to come around and give you permission to do it, because you'll never do it if you wait around for the power to give you permission, right? And so if you want to, do it from a very bottom up, but make it representative, you're going to need something like, deliberative polls or delegations to launch, to bootstrap something like this in a representative way. So basically, I don't know the right elements of the right design, but we have to figure that out.
So I only heard the question about the transition. So the question from here to there, it's really an excellent question, and the $1 million question that I don't know that anybody has the answer to. In my mind, there are three models. You can do the revolution, which is like you replace the elected assemblies with randomly selected ones. I wouldn't recommend it. I think it always ends up very badly. The other option is the add-on solution. So you create a second chamber. Some people have advocated this kind of bicameralism. So you would have an elected legislature, but then you would create an assembly of the people, and you just take a couple of functions from the legislature, from the elected legislatures, like agenda setting maybe, or maybe some issues that they themselves don't want to deal with. And for a few years you would experiment, or issues where they have no legitimacy, and they know that. For example, electoral reform. Where they play judge and party, and that's just unacceptable. So then maybe they would be willing to delegate these decisions to a randomly selected body. The third model is actually a hybridization of existing assemblies. It's been actually done already in the case of Ireland. In 2012, Ireland managed to pass an amendment to their constitution, which until 2012 made homosexuality illegal. And in 2012 they said, okay, enough, we need to do something about this. So they created an assembly, and they decided that there was an assembly of 100 people actually, so 60 members were randomly selected, 33 were elected officials, and one was the chair. And it worked beautifully because it created trust actually between the elected politicians who felt validated and recognized, and the ordinary citizens who all of a sudden had to deal with politicians and couldn't just be antagonistic about it. And I think that third model might actually be the most promising path, because Iceland, something I failed to mention, but I mean the constitution hasn't changed to this day, partly because there was an antagonism between this process where the protagonists basically saw themselves as outsiders, as people outside the system, trying to change it, and the politicians who eventually ignored it. So in 2013, when there was a referendum in 2012 that approved the proposal, the constitutional proposal, 2/3 of the voting population approved the new constitution. But then it went to parliament, and the parliamentarians ignored it. They didn't even vote against it, they just ignored it. And I think so I think from what I've seen, from the experiments that have been tried, the hybrid model seems to me the more promising, even though at the conceptual level it's extremely impure.
No quiero que me pase lo de los políticos, así que quiero abrir la palabra. Si alguien quiere preguntar, por favor. ¿Cómo te llamas?
Hello. Felipe Correa.
Felipe.
My question is, what is the importance of the randomly selected people instead of elected people? That's basically my question.
Okay, so it's a very good question. I have a fondness for randomly selected assemblies, in part for epistemological reasons, meaning that I think in the 18th century we made a mistake, which is to think that if you create an assembly by staffing it with very smart people, or at least people you think are smart because you chose them on an individual basis, you would get the best possible assembly. But from the social scientific evidence and the theories we have today about what causes collective intelligence, especially among deliberative bodies, problem-solving bodies, we now know that you're actually not that well off if you select people one by one and try to maximize their individual talent, as opposed to focus on the group properties. You're better off with a group of average citizens that think very diversely. So it's surprising, but you're better off with an assembly of average Joes who think differently because they come from all over the country than with a group of people who think the same and come from the same top schools and are very smart, but very narrow in their way of approaching problems, and will miss out on a number of dimensions of the political question that an assembly that think about the common good should take into account. So that's actually like the sort of epistemological assumption that I have in the background. But that said, there are a lot of other reasons to want to prefer a randomly selected assembly over an elected one. The fact that it's really about equality as opposed to proving yourself to be superior to others. Elections were historically an oligarchic principle of selection. That's why the Athenians didn't have it, right? So there are many reasons, but these are mine.
¿Alguien más quiere preguntar? Allá la señorita.
Gracias. Yo voy a hacer mi pregunta en español. ¿Tienen...? ¿Sí? Muchas gracias. Estuvieron muy interesantes ambas presentaciones.
¿Cómo te llamas tú?
Egle Flores. Estuvieron muy interesantes ambas presentaciones. Mi pregunta es para Hélène. Me quedé pensando en el caso de Islandia, y tú hablaste diste un dato muy importante, que hay 300.000 aproximadamente habitantes, y me quedé pensando en qué tiene Islandia que permitió que esos 300.000 habitantes se pudieran organizar para hacer este experimento, pensando por ejemplo en nuestro contexto latinoamericano, un país que no es tan dentro del contexto como Belice, que tiene aprox 350, 370.000 habitantes, y yo no he visto un proceso similar. Yo trabajaba antes en esa región, no he visto un proceso similar. ¿Qué necesitamos tener instalado dentro de los espacios ciudadanos para que un experimento así ocurra?
Wow, that's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer. I really don't. Actually, when you started talking about the size of Iceland, I thought you were going to make the classic objection, which is, well, surely it worked there because it's so small, it's so homogeneous, they're all white and Christian, they all get along so well, and it's a consensus-based democracy and all that. So with this objection, I usually reply that, well, first of all, for me, disagreement is fractal. If you look close enough, they hate each other along all kinds of lines, so it's really not true that it's so consensus-based. It's just like the procedures incentivize them to solve things consensually. So it's not just the culture, it's also the procedures that generate this culture of consensus. So in a way, I've got to say, I don't think the Icelanders have anything specific that made that successful. I think that perhaps the advantage they have over other countries is that nobody's paying too much attention to them. Nobody wants to interfere too much with their politics, so they have the freedom of experimenting in a way that larger countries really don't have the freedom. Maybe that's what they have. They also are supposed to have this like Viking spirit of adventure. I don't like these culturalist explanations, but it's true that they also ruin themselves in financial schemes of all kinds. So basically my answer is I don't know, and I suspect that they don't have anything special, and this could be tried anywhere. And if you look at the procedures they use, they all scale. Random selection scales, crowdsourcing scales. I should mention that Egypt attempted crowdsourcing in 2012 as well. They had 65,000 contributions online. It's very hard to, it's true that in theory it would be hard for an assembly to like read all of that. But again, technology could fix it, They could have data sensing softwares and armies of paid analysts. Since we're all going to run out of jobs, we could create those new jobs for democracy. So, yeah.
Bryan?
I thought the question was for Hélène, but I actually don't have anything to add to that at the moment. Sorry.
Yo quería preguntarles por qué 2050. ¿Falta tanto? ¿O me equivoco? ¿No es tanto o es poco?
Good question. I think it likely is going to be 2050 before we, kind of really get the next form of democracy, in place, widely used in, major countries and stable and not getting hacked by the next, adversarial foreign state or, thing like. It will take a long time, many years, likely decades to get there. But we can't wait until then. I think we can and must, make baby steps much faster. And I think, the types of things that, Iceland is doing, that these, liquid democracy groups are doing right now is fantastic. We need to do more of those kinds of things, put them into practice, at small scales, find, in whatever ways we can, further develop the theory, and, like they say for banks, stress test them. We need to figure out ways to, test them against adversaries, kind of simulate attacks before they come under attacks by real adversaries, and really, kind of, and I'm referring both to the technology, making sure that, the technology is up to snuff and that it's subject to strong attacks. Send our, either liquid democracy software or deliberative polling software, to whatever extent technology is used in any of this, send it to DEF CON and see what happens and then make it better. DEF CON is the biggest hacker conference for, they like to break into things. But kind of we need to be very actively doing this development and refinement process and figuring out, what works and what doesn't, and I think we're doing that. We need a lot more of that. And I think we can get, real, very promising, steps in place in the, in smaller scales in the much nearer future, in the coming years.
Hélène?
So I don't know how to predict the future or anything, but I think that new technologies have enabled a sort of global community of people who can exchange ideas, and so ideas circulate much faster. And so my hope is that now we've got a number of examples, we've got all these experiments in democratic innovations, and awareness is growing, and things will be attempted, including in online governance schemes, so you can learn even faster at lower cost what works and what doesn't. So by 2050, who knows? Might be very interesting.
If I can actually add a little bit more, kind of a second thought, another way we can make this happen faster is to explore ways to, kind of getting back to the incentive problem that Jim, brought out very clearly, explore other ways to bring, incentivize people to get into and use these systems. And I'm talking about other kinds of incentives other than the kind of addiction that Twitter and Facebook use to try to keep reading, right? But different kinds of incentives. One of the appeals of some of these ideas that I think that none of us quite got into is the information gathering. The way some of these systems can create new alternative ways for people to learn information, like in the liquid democracy case. It's delegating is partly a delegation of power, but it's also a potential source of information for the voter. So in exchange for delegating my vote to you, I want better information from you to me. A stream of information, and with some of these types of developments, we can both provide better information sources, fight against the make progress against the whole fake news, what is truth kind of thing, and give people more incentive, something in return for their valuable time in doing things like this. And we need to find more ways to do that. And I think again we can make it happen a lot faster if we succeed in doing that.
Bueno, le quiero agradecer también a usted, a la Fundación, por invitarme a participar acá, y ojalá que este sea el germen de algo que siga quizás hasta dónde. Gracias.